There once was a bunny of flame. Amber, I think, was her name. The arrow she shot hit the right spot, but Gacha did ruin this game. Hey guys, James here again with another game review, this time talking about Genshin Impact, a Chinese-made action RPG game which has become immensely popular and one of the highest grossing games out there. In Genshin Impact, you control a party of up to 4 characters as you traverse a massive world, fighting enemies, going on quests, and trying to help solve the various issues which pop up in the massive open world. This game is more or less Breath of the Wild with anime characters. It copies a lot of the open world elements from Zelda, but then wraps it with a JRPG style game with plenty of gacha mechanics as well. Unfortunately, because of the design choices, I found myself constantly comparing it to Breath of the Wild. Despite that, and despite me not being a huge fan of traditional RPG games like this, I was actually surprised by how much I enjoyed Genshin Impact overall. And for me, the big reason I started to play the game less was because of some of the gacha mechanics. In this game, you play as a mysterious traveler who loses their twin after being defeated in battle. You're met by a fairy thing, and you travel through the different regions, accepting quests from various characters, going through different dungeons, and discovering the world and all its secrets. Now, when I said this game is like Breath of the Wild, I mean it. You're thrown into a massive open world, and for the most part, you can do just about anything. If you want to climb a mountain, you can climb a mountain. If you want to dive into the seas, you can do that too. I will say, however, for whatever reason, maybe because of the skimpy looking anime characters, the movement does feel a bit slow at times, although I'm not sure if this is the animations or if the movement is actually just slow. The controls can also feel a bit clunky at times, and I found the camera to not always be the best. Within this giant open world, you'll find a bunch of monster camps which you can defeat for XP and to unlock chests which give you loot. In addition to the monster camps, you'll find all kinds of other objectives or secrets, such as quests from NPCs, or these spirit-looking things which you can help guide to their homes and grant you loot. There's also chests which only open with certain puzzles or challenges, and there are also some hard-to-reach collectibles which can help you gain stamina and other bonuses. Overall, there's a ton of stuff to discover, and in all my random exploration, I found a ton. But while some of the quests can be fun and interesting, I do think that a number of these challenges can be kinda dumb. In particular, I found most of the spirit guiding quests to be sorta silly. A bunch of these go something like, hey, can you reach this spot? Okay, what about this spot? Okay, then how about this spot? Sometimes the spirit might guide you to some difficult to reach places or some enemy camps, but a lot of the time, it felt like it was just taking you on some nonsense route to get to the final zone. It made those puzzles feel sorta shallow. In terms of quests, I thought most were alright, but they weren't necessarily particularly memorable. There's quite a few quests which would fit into a fetch quest mold, and it got a tad annoying when some of the quests were literally just me running back and forth between some points, talking to the same people over and over again. Overall, the quests weren't bad, but not necessarily amazing or memorable. Outside of everything else I just mentioned, there are also a number of dungeons you can discover across the map. There are some with platforming or puzzle aspects, but I didn't find the platforming or puzzles that interesting personally, and in some ways, a lot of these dungeons just felt like more extended versions of some of the challenges you might see in the open world. I felt like most of the dungeons I played were usually more combat focused, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does get a bit monotonous at times. So speaking of combat is a pretty huge part of this game, and I think Genshin Impact does do some pretty interesting things in this department. At first, I didn't love the combat that much. There's no dedicated dodge button or mechanic, so the main way you'd be avoiding anything is by running and dashing around, and at first this felt a little weird to me. The hacking and slashing part of the combat is alright as well, but after a while it can be a little bit repetitive. Where Genshin Impact becomes more engaging though is with the elemental interactions and the dynamic of switching between characters very quickly. See, in Genshin Impact, you can have a party of up to 4 active members. Each member you put in the party will have an elemental type, which their special moves will trigger. Depending on the type of your attacks and the type of the enemy, sometimes elemental reactions can happen. For example, if you're facing a water type enemy, ice attacks can cause them to freeze and be unable to move. I think this dynamic made the combat much more interesting, as it became a lot about comboing and switching between the different elemental types in your party to eliminate enemies as quickly as possible. In my personal opinion though, and I think Breath of the Wild suffers from the same issue, unless you're looking to grind XP, the combat isn't interesting enough to make you want to constantly be engaging enemies, and as a result, I eventually felt like I ended up avoiding a lot of the camps because it became a little too tedious to fight the same enemies over and over again. The first few times you met a new enemy, it would be exciting to learn how they operate, and there are definitely some memorable engagements, but after a while, I just didn't want to deal with it anymore. I will say though, the boss fights and some of the more major enemy fights were more memorable, and I thought they did a pretty good job of trying to make each one feel unique. One other gameplay aspect I did want to mention is the cooking. There's a small timing minigame to play when you're first learning to make a dish, which is at least sort of engaging, and after a number of times successfully making the dish, you could then mass produce them. Alright, so what else? The graphics of the game are pretty great, and having this anime and more cartoony art style should make it age pretty well. The map and world overall are really nice, although it can feel a bit one note. To me, it felt like a lot of it was just green and mountains most of the time, but this is likely largely due to some of the 7 regions not being available quite yet. I'm sure as they expand and update the game, we'll likely be seeing other terrain types in other regions of the map. The UI though is not my favorite. I felt like the menus were fairly confusing at first, and it feels like a lot of the choices kinda lead to the same places, so I do think they could have simplified the UI. In the music and sound department, I think everything is really solid. The music is actually pretty good. I particularly enjoyed hearing some of the more Asian-inspired themes in the Leeway region. One thing I did notice though was that sometimes the transition between music was a bit weird at times. For example, when you engaged an enemy, you would hear the fight music start pumping up, but if you killed something quick enough, it would kind of flame out and fade as it was starting to get more dramatic, and this transition was a bit strange. So next, let's get to the characters and story. Overall, I felt like the story in Genshin Impact was sort of all over the place, which I think is natural given the gacha nature of the game. With any new game, it can be a bit hard to learn new terms and names, but it almost felt like Genshin was constantly throwing new things at you. The writing also tends to be a bit verbose in my opinion, and as a result, there's a lot of exposition which happens. My main issue with the story though, wasn't the story itself, but rather how the gacha mechanics in the game mess with the story. For example, for the first maybe half or so of the main story, the story was chugging along really well and I was actually enjoying the game a lot. Then, once you start getting to the later acts, it starts to spiral in a ton of different directions. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate more content and it's cool to be able to meet characters you can earn, but it can just be a bit jarring when you're told something is urgent and needs to be done, but then you find out there's actually a level gate you have to hit before you can even engage in the next part of the story. This then makes it so you have to go do a side story or a side quest before you continue on with the main plot, and this really takes away from the momentum of the story. Overall though, I did like the characters and voice acting enough, even though it was definitely not great at times. The characters are sort of flat, and I wish they had more variety in their builds and looks, but I did appreciate that there was actually a decent amount of humor thrown in there, especially with the fairy friend Paimon, who I actually kinda liked? I don't know, maybe I'm weird. So I think this is probably where I gotta start talking about the gacha mechanics in the game, and for me personally, I think these mechanics sorta ruin the experience for me. I already mentioned how there are level gates to story quests which slow the story down, but I think another problem that presented itself was essentially it created a need for you to grind, whether it be through side quests or some sort of daily quests you might get. This really messed up the pace of the game, and once I started getting to this grindy portion, I really began to lose interest. Early on, you also find out there are some level gates for the dungeons on the map. This was a big problem for me as it was really silly to me that they would give you this great open world to traverse, but then when you discovered a dungeon, you'd find out that, oh wait, I'm not high enough level to play this yet. I understand why it works this way, as maybe some dungeons are too difficult for lower levels, but it felt really counterintuitive to the open world design. So another big gacha mechanic in the game is the wishes. Essentially throughout the game, you obtain points which you can spend on wishes, which give you a chance at rolling for new characters to add to your party, or maybe some useful weapons or loot. I didn't mind this mechanic so much to be honest, and you do get a number of free wishes and currency, but I definitely did feel a power difference in the gacha characters versus the base characters you earn. It wasn't a huge issue for me, but I wouldn't be surprised if they kept the power creep going and some controversy came out of the system in the future. One big gacha problem that I did notice though was the problem of having like a million currencies and things to craft. It's not a terribly difficult system, but I started to find myself spending a lot of time just crafting. Often you'll need to craft one thing which then can be used to craft another thing which you can then use to obtain this thing to help level up your character. For me personally, this constant need to waste time on tasks like leveling your character and weapons ultimately took me out of the experience of the game, as it became something that you had to constantly do in order to keep up with the enemy power. The dopamine of a level up could only keep me going for so long, and eventually it got kinda tedious. Finally, some of the small things. I did feel like I had some performance issues in later parts of the game. I'm not sure if it's from updates or whatever, but it did make recording later parts of the game difficult for me as the footage kept coming out really laggy. I will say though, I felt the overall support the developers provided for the game was top notch, and there were tons of new content and free rewards being sent out to the player base all the time. Also, I don't know if there's any basis in this, but something sort of sketches me out about the game. Maybe seeing that the launcher automatically runs in admin mode, the controversy with the phone numbers being public, and the fact that the game is run by a Chinese company, I am a bit weary if there might be something shady going on. But that's really just me spewing conspiracy. Overall, while I would say that Genshin Impact is far from a perfect game, I did end up enjoying it a lot more than I thought I would. For the first 30 hours or so, I actually did enjoy signing on, going on different quests, and exploring the world. After a while though, and as it got more grindy, it kinda began to lose me. The game is free and also available on mobile, so if you're interested at all, definitely give it a shot. I do think you can get through the game without spending money, and hell, for the amount of content they give you, I think you could probably justify spending $40 to $60 on it, but to me, it did get grindy, especially towards the end. In the end though, I actually had a lot of fun playing Genshin Impact, and I think with future updates from a very willing developer, the map and game should only be getting bigger and hopefully better. But hey, that's just me. If you've been playing Genshin Impact, let me know down below what you think of the game. I'd love to hear from you guys. Do you agree with me on the gacha mechanics? Or maybe you think I'm full of crap? And hey, if you made it this far, just want to say I really appreciate it. Please do consider hitting that like or subscribe button, as it really helps my channel grow, and that really helps motivate me to make more and better videos. Otherwise, I hope to see you again, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace.